The world has changed. What was good advice in the past may not be good advice now. Scott Terrio is back, and today we discuss outdated financial advice starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Times have changed. COVID and the lockdowns changed everything. Prices are up at the grocery stores, wages haven't kept up, and jobs are changing. We live in a different world, so what was good financial advice decades ago may not be so good and applicable today. What advice no longer applies to our situation today? To discuss it, Scott Terrio returns. Scott is the manager of consumer insolvency here at Hoyes Michaelis. Scott, welcome back.
Thanks, Doug. Good to be back.
So let us talk about some pieces of advice that maybe made sense in the past and don't make sense today. And I want to start with housing. And the reason I want to start with this is you and I did a podcast a couple of years ago now. We actually recorded it in our Toronto office as opposed to, you being at home, me being in the studio as we're doing today. The title of that podcast was Think Twice Before You Get a Home Equity Line of Credit. And it has been our most viewed podcast episode, almost 100,000 views on YouTube. Because
what does that say about the Canadian obsession with housing?
That's exactly what it says. Like we are obsessed with it, and here we are in the summer of 2021, and nothing much has changed. So one of the pieces of advice we always gave people was, well, you got to keep your housing costs to a certain percentage of your monthly spending. And so 30% always used to be kind of the magic number. Does that still make sense today? Is that good advice? Is that bad advice? What do you say?
Well, I've been in the workforce for long enough, 25 years now, to have seen enough of a timeline of change generally with financial, with all things financial, housing, et cetera, I think. And the world has changed dramatically in the last decade or two. I think anybody looking at our country and our economy from outside, I get a lot of people from everywhere telling me, what's going on there? Like, how did you guys get into this situation with housing? And so the 30% rule probably doesn't apply anymore. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Wages and salaries have not kept up with the dramatic rise in house prices. And so therefore, you get a situation where, like you and I see with clients, people are spending upwards of 40% on their housing, even 50. I've seen over 50. It's if you think about that and how little that room that leaves you for maneuvering for the rest of your monthly budget, because everything is cash flow, right? People live month to month. They're tight. We keep seeing those great surveys about how close people are to the edge. I think that's right, actually. But they're not close to bankruptcy necessarily, but they're close to a significant financial event. And these things can snowball. And so therefore, if you don't have that extra room and you're spending 40-50% of your net monthly income on shelter, then you're in a box, right? And so people also go into home ownership, especially now with the whole fear of missing out and everybody rushing headlong into housing, that I think very few of them look down the road and realize the amount of expenses that are involved with owning a home.
Yeah, and if we were to actually do math, which you and I aren't fantastic at, but if a typical, let's not even say a mortgage, let's just say a place to rent in Toronto costs $2,000.
Yeah.
Well, if that was a third of your income, then your take-home pay would have to be $6,000 a month.
Yeah.
30% obviously would be slightly different than that. Okay, well, $6,000 a month in take-home pay is a lot of money. Most people are not bringing in. That would certainly be above the average.
Yeah, you should be okay with that.
Yeah, that's right.
You really should.
Yeah, but if you're
because we see people managing to live for decades on like substantially less than that. Like,
I mean, our typical client would have income of $3,000 a month, $3,500, $4,000. Yeah, half that. So 30%, if you are living in an expensive jurisdiction, is, almost impossible unless you've got a roommate or unless you're taking family income where your spouse also has income as well. So what then is your practical advice? Normally we save practical advice to the end of the show, but what the heck, let's do it right now. What is your practical advice? Should I be shooting for 30% or should I be doing something different?
I think what you should be doing is never mind the percentages. You have to design your life as best you can, as opposed to getting pulled. I think a lot of people get pulled in directions that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise go had they stood back and looked at everything rationally. Get a good grip on your whole financial picture first, and consider, where do you want to live? Like, and why do you want to live there? And or why shouldn't you consider living somewhere else? Like, I mean, are you close to things that are going to be important to your future, to your family, to your future family? And think down the road, right? So, if you want to live in the city, that's great. When you're in your 20s, that's way more fun. But maybe that's not going to work depending on the industry you're in. And a lot of people are going to change jobs a lot of times now. We're going to talk about this more a little bit later. But, sometimes renting in a neighborhood you'd rather live in is better. We'll get to that too. But I think people really need to look at the big picture of their own situation and forget the percentages, because the percentages can be misleading and they can lead you down a path or a geography that you might regret later.
Yeah, I agree. You got to look at the big picture, and
you do.
I
think that's a problem right now. Like, if I can just reinforce that, it's, people are, for the last 3-4 years, especially recently, more recently than that, even, people are just get a house, get in, or you'll never get in. And, the problem is, we see 3 or 4 years or 5 years down the road, what happens with that, right? You leverage yourself up monthly to as much as you can possibly afford to spend. And then, you know what? You don't want to let other things go, right? And so, in other words, okay, I got my house, I'm spending 45% of my income on living, but am I giving anything else up to do that? And I think the answer is no. And so therefore, and we see the amount of consumer debt that homeowners get into versus renters, and it's much higher than what renters get into.
Yeah, and it cascades into a problem. And I think if we were to look forward to the year 2022, by which point hopefully we are through the whole virus COVID thing, we won't be completely through it, but hopefully we're in much better shape. There will be, I suspect, a lot more work from home than there was in 2019. Well, that certainly impacts the housing decision as well. Maybe it is possible to live farther outside of the city if you're only coming into your workplace 1 or 2 days a week. So you got to factor everything into it. And I guess that's really the message on point number one, though. It's got to be 30% and that's it. In some cases, more makes sense. In some cases, less makes sense. But look at the big picture.
Yeah, like you could be spending 45, but it makes more sense, right? Because, for example, just to live in a certain area might mean that you don't have to spend other things, right?
Yeah, you don't need a car, for example.
Yeah, or whatever. Like, maybe if you're working from home and you found a place in a smaller city, all the trappings and other expenses that come with the city might not be there, and therefore, 45% makes a lot more sense for you because you can handle the other 55, right?
Yep. Yeah, maybe it costs 40% or 50% to live in the city, but I don't need a car, which would have been another 10 or 20%. So I think looking at
a parking space, which costs $100,000.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. And I realize we're talking a little bit Toronto centric here, but the same concepts apply everywhere else. Now, that leads us into the discussion of jobs, which leads us into the discussion of student loans. And I went to university. I think you have an education as well. It was decades ago in both of our cases, but I have become much less enamored with, higher education, formal higher education. I don't
Yeah.
think we should just default to, well, everyone's got to go to college or university. I think 500 years from now, there will still be plumbers because we'll still be using water. And therefore, perhaps a university education is not the be all and the end all, particularly when you have to get a student loan to do it. So what the standard advice used to be, go to university. If you need to get a loan to do it, you'll be able to earn enough to get out of it. What's your advice today?
Yeah, I'll echo what you said. In our business, we meet with a lot of people who have not gone to university. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing financially, but we get to see how much people can make doing jobs that are really needed. And by every measure, right, these days, there are shortages of people who are good at fixing things, or people who are good at making things, or try and get a contractor right now. And I realize the housing market is kind of at its peak insanity, but even in normal times, getting a plumber or an electrician or someone like that is very hard. And I think my generation and the ones after me have been even less apt because of the push to university education versus trades or whatever, that we're going to need those people big time. And you can write your own ticket almost. And so I just think, rather than taking on a ton of student debt, because we also see what happens with that, right? I had a guy a couple of months ago, still working with him, but he's got multiple degrees, like 3 or 4 degrees. He's been in school for 12 years or something. So he's in his early 30s, and he ended up getting a government job. Well, that's okay because it's safe and it's secure and pension and all that. But his entry salary is horrific for his age. So it's his entry salary would be okay if he was 24, but not 33, because now he's got all the wife, the kids, the whatever. And so he just spent $150,000 over time on an education. But now, because of his age, he's making what guys that are 8 or 9 years younger than him are making. So you got to be careful. What are you aiming for, right? Because he had a very frank discussion with me saying, I didn't expect anything less than making 6 figures once I was done all of this. Well, and so here's a guy who could have probably by the age of 24 been doing something else and fairly lucrative, right? And yet, so I think when, you're right about the former obsession with university, I think that needs to change in society. And I think people need to consider the long-term impact of their student debt and what they expect to actually be making at the end of it.
Yep, absolutely. And that's hard to do because you're predicting the future. But take a look at what current salaries are now and take a look at how much your student loan debt will be when you're done. And that may cause you to look at different things, or maybe you do your education over a longer period of time. You do it part-time for a while, whatever. But graduating with a ton of student debt and not a great job is not a great strategy. So I am less a believer. Well, I'm not a believer in taking on massive debt for student debt. It just doesn't make sense. Now let's go back to housing and real estate, because that's something that everybody seems to talk. And you alluded to this a bit earlier. Buying versus renting. So the standard advice has always been, you want to buy because you don't want to be paying someone else's mortgage. You don't want to be paying the landlord's mortgage. You want to be putting that money towards your own wealth building. And certainly, if you look at the last 10 years, the last 20 years, owning real estate has been an excellent investment. You could have bought the absolute worst house at the worst price in the worst area of any city, and almost for sure it's worth way more now than when you bought it a few years ago. So under what circumstances then would you suggest that automatically buying and getting a mortgage is not a good idea? Are there times when renting makes more sense?
Well, there are times when renting makes more sense, yes. And I think one of those things to consider is your mobility, your flexibility in terms of your career. This is key, I think, for young people right now. And so, anyone entering any kind of profession or industry right now, it's not like it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago where you knew you were going to have that job. You could see the future, you could see going up in that company, whatever. Like, that stuff doesn't happen anymore. And people can expect to change jobs 4 or 5 times in their lifetime right now. I've seen studies on that. And so you have to think all those times where if you're tied into a house, and when you have a house, you're pretty tied into it. I realize, you can always sell, but then you got to buy somewhere else anyway. And I think if you know you're going to be changing jobs multiple times, and not only that, but foregoing opportunities, right? Like I know people myself, even my generation, Gen X, who gave up on job opportunities somewhere else because they had a house and they didn't want to uproot everybody and all this stuff. So, it depends what's important to you, right? As a renter, you also get opportunity costs. And so if you're not spending all that stuff on your house, and that can be, there's a guy I know who uses the term the $1,000 weekend. And that's where, if you're a homeowner, you can easily drop $1,000 on any given weekend where the weather's good because you realize I got to fix something in the house. So again, I think young people should consider flexibility, even older people, of renting versus owning, and just generally being able to plan your life a little more intentionally, rather than getting dragged around by what could potentially be an anchor to you, which is owning a house.
Yeah, and you made a couple of really key points there. You talked about risk, and the housing market has been going up for years and years and years. That does not mean it will go up forever. But the real risk is, okay, I've got this. Well, I guess there's risks of major things going wrong with your house. I got to fix the washer and the dryer and the roof leaks, right, and I got to come up with $30,000. But if there is a job offer in 2 cities over, then if I'm renting and if I'm on a month-to-month lease, it's not a big deal. I cancel that lease, get a new one, and off I go. But if if I have a house, you're right. Selling a house, buying a new one takes a lot more time. You also sorry, go ahead.
Thing, about renting. That I was thinking about is renting, because rent is significantly lower in a lot of places than owning, would potentially allow people to live in a neighborhood they otherwise couldn't afford to live in. So when you're in your 20s, it's kind of fun to live in, certain neighborhoods of a city, rather than, pushing yourself outwards, or as they say, driving till you qualify. And so you could have the opportunity of living in an area that you otherwise couldn't buy into, for example.
Yeah, and you also address the issue of opportunity cost, which kind of is the same concept. So if I'm going to buy a house, then I have to have a down payment. And so that down payment might be $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, $100,000, whatever the number is. Well,
10,000.
Yeah, I know. What am I? Well, that would be for one of your parking.
You're making stuff up.
One of your parking spots that you wanted to buy for $100,000.
Let's call it 80,000.
Yeah. So if you're in a big city, then you're looking at $100,000. If $1 million place, 10% down is $100,000. So that $100,000 now is invested in my house. It is not invested in something else, the stock market, whatever, that perhaps could be generating a return for me.
Crypto, baby.
Crypto, yes, absolutely. You should put it all in crypto.
Ethereum,
yes. There you go. So this is not financial advice for anybody.
But the point is, though, the point I think of that is, and we're making fun of it, is that when other opportunities do come up, right, and all your money's in your house, right? Well, okay, you could probably do a refi or a second or whatever, but then you're adding long-term debt on, and you're missing out on something else potentially.
Yeah.
And so it's not all bad.
Yeah. And I think Ted and I talked about this on a podcast recently, house rich versus, cash poor. Yeah. Well, if all the money is tied up in the house, then I can't go on a vacation. I can't do this. I can't do that. So again, we are not saying you should not buy a house. We're not saying you should rent. What we are saying is you should not default to any one position that, my parents say I have to buy a house, so I'm buying a house, and every house always goes up. I think you got to look at the big picture, which takes us then to the issue of debt, which is what you were kind of addressing there as well. If you have a mortgage, then you have massive debt. That's the biggest debt most people will ever have. The theory, and you also use the phrase, drive till you can afford it. The theory being, if you can finance it, then you can afford it. You go to the car dealership, and if you can get a loan for that car, it doesn't matter what the car costs, then you can afford it. That makes no sense. I assume you agree that makes no sense.
Yeah, well, so for a couple of months there on Twitter, I was banging on about this stuff and saying, because what I take issue with is the notion or the definition of affordability, because people think that if they qualify for a mega mortgage that they can afford it. And so, all you did was afford the qualification. You didn't afford the ability every single month for the next 30 years without fail, with nothing going wrong. And how often does that happen? So again, we saw at the start of COVID how few people had actual material savings. And now you consider, okay, you just scraped by and qualified for the mega mortgage. Great. You get in for whatever way you could. But now you got, 3 or 4 decades where you're barely making ends meet every month. And you and I see this, and how much more, again, back to the consumer credit, how much unsecured debt homeowners have versus renters. And that's because they run into stuff. So basically you put yourself in a noose where nothing can go wrong. And I mean, we see people come to us presenting with 1 or 2 or 3 events over the course of 12 to 24 months that led them from being, as they say, 3 years ago, I was in great shape, great credit score, I had lots of, and now I'm here sitting in your office. So just because you qualify doesn't mean you can necessarily afford this thing long term. And I think that's the issue I have with it.
Yeah. And again, that all comes back to risk. And you're right. There are a ton of people who in January of 2020 were doing great. And by April of 2020, were in very serious financial trouble. And if you owned a small business that was shut down for a year and a half, then that really ramps up the risk. So
yeah, I mean, COVID's an extreme example, but I think what it taught us is that anything can happen. I mean, nobody 2 years ago had any idea we were going to be in this situation. And so the events that we see are much less dramatic, but they can knock you off the rails pretty badly. Like, a family member gets sick. Okay, well, you have to go help them. Well, your boss doesn't like that idea. And so you may lose your job to do that. You could get sick yourself. Divorce is like a third of all marriages end in divorce now. Like, there's all of these things that when you tie yourself into something that massive for that long a term, it's impossible to foresee what can happen. So, approval is not necessarily affordability, basically.
Right. And of course, the approval is done by the lender who wants to make money off you. So they will lend you.
They're not going through all this stuff with you.
No, they will lend you as much as they can.
I don't blame them. I mean, that's their job, right? If you're a broker or an agent right now, fill your boots, man. Like, go nuts. But if you're the person who is doing the buying, you need to be covering your own ass. And that's even more so because we realize and recognize that, again, it's back to your book. Know who's on the other side of the table and what their interests are, right?
That would be Straight Talk on Your Money, the biggest financial myths and mistakes and how to avoid them. Yeah, it's okay. I'll put it on the screen repeatedly. So, and a number of these issues we did talk about in the book. Speaking of talking about things, Straight Talk on Your Money. Do you think we do not talk about money? Is that still a taboo, or do you think that's changed?
It is totally a thing. Now, I find as you move down the age scale, it gets better. People in their 20s are sharers by virtue of growing up with social media. So I think, people I meet with in their 20s and 30s even are pretty open with their finances. People over 40 like me, still not something you talk about all the time. But Gen X are much better than the boomers who don't say a word. And I'll give you an example. So I've had adults in their 40s bring their senior parents in because, for whatever reason, mom got sick or mom died. And I went and sat down with dad because mom did all the finances. Now she's dead. So, and then when I looked and saw what was happening with their wealth management, it was a disaster. And so talking about that disaster 15 years before would have prevented the disaster. And it was just by virtue of our, old colonial British, don't talk about money, sex, or religion. I think people need to have frank discussions with each other. And I've met enough couples who don't know each other's finances. And you're married and you like that stuff you got to talk about. And so the earlier you do it, it's just like when someone comes in to see us, the earlier you see me, the more I can help you. Basically, It's just like talking about money. If my dad or my brother or my cousin, like I've had this happen, like, people do come to me outside of work, and I've had a couple people do it where they said, I think I'm in a lot of trouble here. And I think if they'd have come to see me two years after, they'd have been past helping beyond an insolvency filing, basically. So
yeah, it doesn't hurt to talk about it. And, we're big believers in talking to someone who actually knows something. I'm not saying you shouldn't get all your advice from,
right, is
Twitter and Reddit, but
source, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
like my brother, the cop, said I should invest in this gold mine in Peru. And that's an actual story, by the way. And so, you have to talk to people who know what they're doing and do it soon. Certainly if you suspect a family member is in some trouble, ask them about it. The worst they're going to do is tell you off, I suppose. But, I've had people who broached that subject with their senior parents and were terrified to do so. But once they did, I think that person was waiting for somebody to ask them so that they didn't have to bring it up themselves.
Yep. Yeah. The floodgates open. So You're right. If something seems a little off, or even if it doesn't, then ask questions. Okay. Absolutely. We're going to finish with the lightning round here. We got a few minutes left. I know that, balances on credit cards is sort of one of your pet peeves. So tell me about that. So
what we're talking about here is, the old notion of keeping a certain balance on your credit card, a portion of, the maximum amount, because that'll help your credit score, which I don't think is entirely true. There is an element of that because lenders want you to have a certain balance. And again, when you obsess about your credit score, that the reason they're saying carry a balance on there is because they make money off it. I would say never have a balance on your credit cards, period. And that make me sound like an old guy, but, just beware of the advice and where it's coming from. You're not going to be good enough to game your credit score if you're keeping a 20% balance on there because you think that's going to help you. What that's going to do is that's going to take up a lot of your time and attention, because if you let that go and it gets bigger, it will hurt your credit score. So I just tell people, because our clients do ask us this when they get, either secured credit cards to rebuild their credit during their proposals or whatever. And I say, just pay it, right? Pay it off in full. That way you're not going to get into more trouble than you're already in.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the best balance is zero. And I know you want to keep my utilization at some number. No, I think zero is the good number. And in fact, you want to stay out of trouble. You go to the store and buy something, go home and pay it off that day. And then you can never get in trouble. A credit
card should be used for convenience, but consider it cash. And then as long as you do that, you're never going to have a credit score issue in your life if you do that. And it's way easier to keep track of a zero balance, because that way, if it goes to 100, you'll know I got to keep that at zero. But you got to watch that bit of advice. I think.
A credit card is a substitute for cash, not a way to borrow. Okay, right. Give me one final thing, one final piece of advice that maybe isn't as great as it used to be.
So one old piece of advice, or outdated, that I think still holds up, is having a savings and emergency fund. I know you and I talk about this a lot. People probably get bored of it, but we saw again at the start of COVID, right? COVID hit in March 2020. By early April, I was fielding 9 or 10 calls a day from people who couldn't pay their rent or their mortgage because they didn't have any savings. And I think that is exactly illustrative of that. You see the studies that say the Canadians are amongst the lowest savers in the world. And I'll tell you what, the first 60 days of COVID, we saw it in spades. And so if you can stick away a substantial amount, because remember that, we go back to rent. Okay. If rent is $1,500 or $2,000 a month in most places, you need 2 of those if you need to move suddenly, right? And plus additional moving costs. So you probably need a few thousand in 2021 as opposed to a couple of thousand 30 years ago. So I think you can never go wrong having an emergency fund as long as you don't touch it and use it for actual emergencies. And people can be surprised at how quickly they can build a fund if they do it smartly, like have a percentage of every second paycheck go directly into an account. You don't see it. It's not painful.
Yeah. People today think that, I don't need an emergency fund. I got a line of credit. Yeah, that's all well and good until the bank says, you know what, you don't qualify for the line of credit, because we've heard lots of calls like that where, they chopped my line of credit. I don't have it anymore because I'm now a higher risk. Having cash in the bank is way better.
It's all fine and good till you're in my office.
Yeah, exactly right. And then it's not so good. So excellent. Well, I think that is a whole bunch of good advice that is, or good examples of things that are outdated but actually make sense. That actually don't make sense, but I think we've tried to give the practical spin on what does make sense now. Scott Terrio, thanks very much for being here today.
Thanks again, Doug.
And so I will put in the links to the show notes, that podcast Scott and I did a couple of years ago that everybody's watched about home equity lines of credit. I will also put a link to Scott's Twitter profile should you wish to watch as he trolls the big banks and everybody else.
I keep getting invited to less and less things.
Yeah, there you go. It's well, sometimes we have our.
I think I'll have done my job when nobody asks me to speak anywhere ever again.
There you go. We may be heading there. There you go. So that was our show on lists of outdated advice. Housing costs should be no more than 30% of your monthly spend. Student loans are good debt. Buying is better than renting. If you can finance it, you can afford it. Don't talk about money. Scott mentioned carrying balances on your credit card and savings and emergency funds, which we're actually in favor of. We think that is a good idea. So hopefully that has been helpful for you all. If you have liked or enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe and share it on YouTube and on all of your favorite podcasting apps. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. For Scott Terrio, that was Debt Free in 30. And that was actually...